Chapter 15 The Brimstone Ship. On February 7th, 1963, a ship called the Marine Sulfur Queen left the world of the living. A few days after setting sail from Baymount, Texas, the ship vanished off the coast of Florida without as much as a single radio message. All they found was an oil slick, a few life jackets, and the persistent smell of brimstone, the awful odor associated with rotten eggs, and, coincidentally, the smell also associated with hell. There was, of course, a perfectly logical and non-demonic explanation for the smell. The Sulfur Queen was an old World War II tanker that was now being used to transport liquid sulfur, also known as brimstone. However, the eerie smell combined with the fact that the ship mysteriously vanished in the Bermuda Triangle naturally led people to consider a dark, supernatural end to the unlucky brimstone barge. In truth, the death of the Sulfur Queen was extremely bizarre, but not exactly supernatural. Stated simply, the Sulfur Queen was overcome by a very large ocean fart. On the fateful February day, a massive ball of natural gas, 200 feet wide, burst up from beneath the ocean floor, and when the bubbles surfaced, the entire ship dropped into it in less than a second. The bubble burst, water rushed in, covering the ship, and it was gone. The Sulfur Queen was very literally swallowed by the sea. There were the expected few moments of utter panic and mortal terror as the crew of the tragically submerged vessel made their final journey down that path of light to wherever they were going. Then, less than a minute later, the ship itself got to where it was going, namely the bottom of the sea. But that wasn't the end of it, because what no one knew was that the old vessel was the last of its kind. It was the final ship built by a failing shipyard, which closed down the day the Sulfur Queen first launched out of dry dock. The workers, knowing an era was coming to an end, built the ship with as much care as a team of shipbuilders could muster. Their love of this ship was welded into every rivet. Such an ignoble death to this well-loved vessel could not be suffered lightly by the fabric of eternity. And so, when the waters surged about it and the methane-heavy air finally settled, a ghost of the Queen remained, permanently afloat in the half-world of Everlost. Since no soul had crossed over with it, the ghost of the Sulfur Queen drifted for years. No crew, no passengers. It drifted, that is, until the McGill found it, and turned it into the greatest pirate ship ever to sail the waters of eternity. And, except for one nasty run-in with the Flying Dutchman, its supremacy on the seas had never been challenged. Since the evil smell of brimstone still surrounded the vessel, the McGill found it useful for inspiring fear, because the McGill knew that when it came to being a monster, image was everything. One only needed to sniff the brimstone to be convinced that the Sulfur Queen was a ship from hell, rather than a ship from Texas. The McGill had remodeled the tanker into into as proper a pirate ship as possible. It wasn't too hard to make it menacing, for the ship was already rusted and rancid when it crossed into Everlost. That the smell and the McGill's fearsome reputation were all it took to make the Sulfur Queen the floating terror of Everlost. On the open deck, the McGill had fashioned himself a throne made from pieces of this and that, pipes torn from the ship, fancy portrait frames, curtains from old buildings that had crossed over. The throne was studded with jewels that were glued on with old bubble gum. It was, in short, a monstrosity, just like the McGill himself, and it suited him just fine. The McGill's most recent adventure had been a raid in New York. He had long heard rumors of the Haunter, and his mystical little dojo where he had taught kids to haunt, with weird discipline, like it was some sort of martial art. The McGill had no patience for legends that didn't involve him. As far as he was concerned, such legends were competition and needed to be silenced. The Haunter was silenced well. Oh, and he had put up a fight, levitating and summoning up wraiths in black robes that walked like human beings, as if any of this could impress the McGill. He had learned early on that one's physical strength in Everlost had nothing to do with muscle mass. It had all to do with the strength of one's will, and the McGill was surely the most willful creature that ever lived. After he had shredded the Wrath warriors with his claws, the McGill took on the Haunter himself. The little Neanderthal had put up a fight, but in the end he was no match for the McGill. "If you ever get out of here," he had shouted at the barrel where the Haunter had been sealed, "you had better never cross my path again, or I'll find something worse for you." He wasn't sure if the Haunter had even heard him, because he never stopped cursing from within the barrel. The McGill had dined royally on the spread of food that his Haunter had somehow pulled from the living world. He feasted for hours and threw his scraps to his associates, who were happy to have them. That's what he called his crew, associates. Now, still full from the feast, they had returned to the ship with a dozen barrels, leaving behind only the one that contained the Haunter. "So, what do we do with them?" asked Pinhead, as the McGill sat in his throne, looking at the barrels now arranged haphazardly on the deck. Pinhead was the McGill's chief associate. Somewhere along the line, Pinhead had forgotten the correct proportion of a human head to its body, and so the size of his head had receded like an apple left on a windowsill. The difference was not so profound that he looked like a complete freak. It was subtle. When you looked at Pinhead, you knew something was wrong, but you weren't quite sure what it was. "Sir, the barrels, what shall we do with them?" "I heard you," the McGill snapped. He rose from his throne and lopped in his awful crooked stride toward the barrels. "According to the Haunter, there's someone inside every single one of them," Pinhead had told him, with a certain excitement in his voice. In life, Pinhead must have been the kind of kid who would rip through a cereal box to get to the prize at the bottom. "We'll see," the McGill snapped. "And I'll bet these kids have been pickling for so long," Pinhead said, "that they'll worship whoever sets them free." This gave the McGill pause for thought. He stroked his chin, a bulbous thing as rough and unshapely as a potato. It was an interesting idea. Others feared him, but never was he the subject of worship and complete adoration. "You think so?" "Only one way to find out." And then Pinhead added, If they're ingrates, we'll put 'em back in the barrels and dump them into the sea." "All right, then," said the McGill, and he gestured to his associates, lurking in the shadows. "Open them up." Although not even the Haunter knew this, afterlights were very much like wine when sealed in a barrel. The longer a wine is left to age, the better it gets. Unless, of course, something goes wrong and it turns to vinegar. Neither Nick nor Leaf had turned to vinegar. However, both had adapted in his own unique way to their situation. While Leaf became like a baby in a womb and had lost any sense of time and space, Nick did the opposite. He was aware of every passing moment, never forgot exactly where he was, and didn't even forget who he was. So those stupid little pieces of paper he had written his name on weren't an entire waste of time. Nick found he could pass the time by taking an inventory of everything he remembered from his life and his afterlife. Even though some key memories had already been lost, he was still close enough to his earthly existence to remember quite a lot. He tried to list alphabetically every single song he knew and sang each. He cataloged every movie he remembered ever seeing and tried to watch them in his head. With nothing to reflect on but himself, he came to realize that he had spent far too much time complaining and worrying. If he ever managed to get out of the barrel, he knew he'd be a different person, because nothing, not even sinking into the earth, could be worse than this. And so both Nick and Leaf had been profoundly changed by their pickling experience. Leaf had found a bizarre state of spiritual bliss, and Nick became strong and fearless. Nick felt the commotion of his barrel being removed from the Haunter's lair. He had no idea where he was being called off to, but the very fact that there was activity around him was a hopeful sign. Counting out the seconds in his mind, he waited for something momentous to happen. Nick had counted 661,259 seconds from the time his barrel had first begun to move until the top was pried off. The tops were pried off of 3 barrels simultaneously. Nick stood up right away, ready to thank his rescuer. Having had nothing but darkness and pickle brine in his eyes for many weeks, he couldn't really see much of anything at first. There were other kids around him. To his left was an open barrel with someone still submerged beneath the surface. To his right, standing up in another barrel, was a kid Nick did not recognize, who began screaming and never stopped. Nick stood there in amazement, wondering how his lungs could hold out. He sounded like a human air raid siren. Then he realized that since the kid didn't actually have lungs anymore, being a spirit and all, he never had to stop for breath. He could just scream until the universe ended, which might have actually been his plan. The kid had clearly turned to vinegar in his barrel. "Get the screamer out of here," said a slobbery voice. "Take him and chime him." Several kids nearby took the screamer out of his barrel and carried him away. All the while, he never stopped screaming. Poor kid, Nick thought. That could have been me. But it wasn't, and it was a great consolation to know that he had survived his time in pickle purgatory. Nick blinked, and blinked again, forcing his eyes into focus, ready to face whatever situation he would now find himself in. He was on the deck of a ship that was sprinkled with crumbs of some sort. There were crewmen around him, all of them kids, and standing in front of an ugly throne was what could only be described as a monster. Leaf did not know the top of his barrel had been pried off. He didn't know much of anything. He heard a kid screaming, but it sounded far away, not in his universe, not his concern. Leaf now existed without time or space. He was everything and nothing. It was wonderful. Then, when someone grabbed his hair and hauled him upright, he found that the place of infinite peace he had discovered within himself did not leave him. Whether he had lost his mind or had become one with the universe was a matter of opinion. "Who are you?" a wet, distorted voice asked. "What can you do? What use will you be to me?" Leaf was still on the first question. "His name is Leaf," said a familiar voice. He remembered the voice belonged to someone named Nick. All at once, Leaf's memories came back to him. He remembered his journey from the forest, his time in front of the video game, the fact that he had been in a barrel. Someone approached him. No, not someone, something. It had one eye the size of a grapefruit, filled with squiggly veins. The other eye was normal size, but dangled from its socket. "I don't like the look of him," the monster said. "He looks like someone made out of clay, and forget to finish him." "I think he's forgotten what he looks like," said a boy with an unusually small head. The monster raised a 3-fingered claw and pointed it at Leaf. "I order you to remember what you look like." "Leave him alone," shouted Nick. "I order you to remember." Leaf suspected he knew what this creature was, and he knew he should have been terrified of it, but he was not. The creature moved closer to Leaf. When it opened its mouth, a tongue lashed out that forked into 3 octopus tentacles. "I order you to remember what you look like, or you're going overboard." Leaf smiled happily. "Okay." Then he closed his eyes and rummaged around through his mind until he found a memory of his face. The moment he did, he could actually feel his features changing. When he opened his eyes, he knew he was himself again, or at least something close. The creature studied him with his huge eye and grunted. "Good enough," he said. Nick, still waist deep in his barrel, watched the creature closely, ready to fight it if necessary. Then something occurred to Nick that almost crushed his newfound courage. Are you the McGill?" The creature laughed and limped across the deck over to Nick, crumbs crunching beneath his fungus-ridden feet as he walked. "Yes, I am," the creature said. "You've heard about me. Tell me what you heard." Nick grimaced from the creature's awful stench. "I heard that you were the devil's pet dog, and you chewed through your leash." That was the wrong thing to say. The McGill roared and kicked Nick's barrel so hard it shattered, spilling brine all over the deck. "Pet dog? Who said I was a dog? I'll put them on a leash." "Just some kid," Nick said, trying not to look at Leaf. "If you're not a dog, then what are you?" The McGill poked a sharp claw against Nick's chest. "I'm your king and commander. I own you now." Nick didn't like the sound of that. "So, we're slaves?" "Associates," said the boy with the unusually small head. The McGill ordered their pockets checked for anything of value, and when nothing was found, the McGill raised his claw and pointed to the hatch. "Take them below," he said to a group of associates. "Find out what they can do, and make them do it." The McGill watched them go with one eye and kept the other eye trained on Pinhead. Once the two new kids were gone, the McGill waved a clawed hand. Open the next one. Pinhead did as he was told. The next barrel, however, was empty, as was the next and the next. Just brine with no one inside. I can't understand it, Pinhead said. The haunter said there was someone in each barrel. He lied, the McGill grunted, and retired to the captain's quarters, which were just behind his great open-air throne. 14 barrels and only 3 occupants. It did not sit well with the McGill. This wasn't the first time such a thing had happened. If he had had a nickel for every time he expected to find an afterlife and he didn't, he'd be a rich monster. It was the thought of nickels that made the McGill turn to his safe. It was a bulky iron thing, built right into the wall. Only the McGill knew the combination. It had taken him more than a year of trying until he found the right one, and now the safe was his prized possession. He turned the wheel, feeling the familiar rattle of the tumbler. Then he closed his claw around the lever and pulled it open. Inside was a bucket filled with coins so worn it was impossible to tell their denominations, or what country they had come from. The coins had been taken from enemies or associates, and anyone who was not an associate was an enemy. It was common knowledge that money in Everlost was of no real use, but the McGill kept the coins all the same. If they're so worthless, why do you keep them in your safe? Pinhead had once asked. The McGill had chosen not to answer him, and Pinhead was wise enough not to ask again. The easy answer was that the McGill kept everything, but the real answer was that the coins were the most plentiful objects in Everlost, and as such were of special interest to him. The only other item he kept in the safe was hidden beneath the bucket of coins. It was a small slip of paper 1/2 an inch wide and 2 inches long. On the tiny paper were printed the following words: "A brave man's life is worth 1,000 cowardly souls." He would read and reread that slip of paper to remind him why he patrolled the shores and went on raids of Everlost encampments. Then he would return it to its hiding place beneath the bucket of coins. Although few knew it, there was more to the McGill than mindless looting and pillaging. That little slip of paper was a constant reminder to him that he had a larger goal. Nick, still disorientated from his rebirth into the world of almost living, stumbled from the light of the deck into the dim, narrow corridor of the ship. The McGill's associates prodded him and leafed forward, while around them the rest of the McGill's crew jeered at them as they passed. Leaf waved and smiled like some returning hero, and it just made Nick mad. "Will you stop that?" Nick demanded. "Why are you so happy?" The jeering kids, Nick noticed, all had crooked teeth and mismatched features, ears slightly off, noses twisted, tweaked, or flattened, like their faces were putty that the McGill had played with. Some were girls, some were boys, but in truth, it was impossible to tell the difference anymore. Nick dubbed them ugloids, and wondered if they were as ugly inside as out. They all seemed somewhat dim-witted. Perhaps service to the McGill had made them that way. And since none of them seemed too highly motivated, Nick took a calculated risk. He pulled out of the grip of the 2 ugloids holding him, grabbed Leaf's hand, and began to run. As he suspected, the ugloids were slow on the uptake, and by the time they took to chasing them, Nick and Leaf had a nice lead down the hall. "Where are we going?" asked Leaf. "We'll know when we get there." The truth was, Nick had no idea. Courage and spontaneity were new to him. It hadn't occurred to him until after he had run from the ugloids that perhaps he had confused courage with stupidity. He should have had a plan for escape. After all, this was a ship, and there were a limited number of places they could go. But now he was committed, so he kept on running, turning down corridors and climbing through hatches, hoping he wouldn't take a wrong turn, which of course he eventually did. With the ugloids gaining on them, Nick pushed open a hatch and found that it opened onto one of the ship's holds. A cavernous space 30 feet deep, 40 feet long, and smelling horribly of rotten eggs. There was a steep iron stairway winding down into it, but he had come through the hatch with such speed that he and Leaf missed the stairway completely, flipped over the railing, and dropped into the depths of the hold. The fall would have killed them, had they been alive, but things being what they were, it was merely a nuisance. They crashed loudly into furniture and picture frames and statues and, When they managed to get their bearings, they found themselves in the middle of the McGill's grand treasure trove. It looked more like a dragon's hoard than anything else. Shiny things like chandeliers thrown together with chests of drawers, and automobile axles, like several moving trucks, had just dumped the contents of city-wide garage sale here and left. Mary would know what to do with all this, Nick thought. She would organize it, distribute it, put it to good use. Clearly the McGill had no purpose beyond hoarding it, as evidenced by the fact that everything was painted with the words "property of the McGill." His purpose was greed, nothing more. Nick could imagine the McGill capturing finders and taking everything they had. Maybe he even forced the finders to work for him, collecting items that had crossed over, just so the McGill could store them here. By the time Nick and Leaf had made their way through the tree troves to the nearest hatch, Pinhead was there, with plenty of associates to back him up. "Hi," said Leaf, all sunshine and joy. "Did you miss us?" Pinhead took Leaf's weirdness and sarcasm and tossed Leaf aside. Pinhead took Leaf's weirdness as sarcasm and tossed Leaf aside. Then he grabbed Nick and pushed him against the wall. "The McGill wants to know how you can be useful to him." "We're nobody's slaves," Nick said. Pinhead nodded. "I knew you'd be too defiant to be of any use." "Does that mean I can go back into my barrel now?" asked Leaf. Pinhead ignored him. "Chime them," Pinhead ordered. "Chime them along with all the other useless ones." Then the crew came forward, grabbing them, forcing them through the hatch and down a narrow, dim hallway toward another hatch labeling "chiming chamber," with sloppy, childlike paint strokes. Nick struggled against them, but it was no use, and although his first instinct was to try to talk his way out of this, he wasn't going to give Pinhead the satisfaction of seeing him plead. Pinhead pulled open the hatch. "Have fun," Pinhead said with a nasty snicker. Nick suspected there was no fun to be had at all. Okay, and now there's a little excerpt at the end. "There is only one rule for swimming in Everlost," writes Mary Hightower. "Don't. Large bodies of water are very dangerous for us afterlights. For if the land is like quicksand, the water is like air. If you happen to fall into a lake, river, or ocean, you'll find the water about as buoyant as clouds to someone falling through the sky. You'll hit the bottom with such speed you'll find yourself embedded 20 feet into the sea floor before slowing down to regular sinking velocity, and that would be that. Ghost ships are the only exception to this rule. Like the Everlost buildings that remain on land long after leaving the living world, ghost ships still do what they were built to do, that is, float. And nothing, not tidal wave, nor hurricane, nor torpedo could ever sink them. Just don't get thrown off of one."